Welcome, everyone. I am Tissyana Martin, the Program Manager for Professional Development at the American Society for Cell Biology. We are pleased to offer Online with LSE as a part of ASCB's Professional Development Series. Today, our facilitator, Dr. Tissyana Camacho, will be introducing our feature author for this installment of Online with LSE. Tissyana, you can now turn your camera on.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Good morning, everyone. Dr. Diaz-Martinez and I are on the West Coast, so it's morning for us, but good afternoon to other folks. My name is Tissyana Camacho, and I'm a faculty member in the Department of Child and Adolescent Development at Cal State Northridge, located in Los Angeles. I have the pleasure of moderating today's discussion with Dr. Diaz-Martinez. Just to remind everyone in the audience, the goal of this webinar series is to be sort of a virtual journal club to provide some behind the scenes insight into biology education studies. I would also like to strongly encourage everyone to submit questions as we go. That's what really makes these conversations, so your input is really wanted. So please make sure you're actively using the Q&A feature to submit your questions. We will synthesize questions and make them visible as we go. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Laura Diaz-Martinez. She is an assistant professor of biology at Gonzaga University. She obtained her PhD in molecular, cellular, developmental biology, and genetics at the University of Minnesota. Prior to joining Gonzaga, she was associate director for the campus office for undergraduate research initiatives at the University of Texas at El Paso, also known as UTEP. And her work at Gonzaga allows her to pursue her two passions, so how cells work and also teaching students about the wonderful world of cells and molecules. Today, Dr. Diaz-Martinez is going to discuss her work on integrating responsible and ethical conduct of research education into course-based undergraduate research experiences, which is funded by the National Science Foundation. Go ahead, Dr. Diaz-Martinez.
Thanks, Tissyana, for really nice introduction. Thank you. And thanks everybody for joining us here and for your interest in our work. So I am going to start by, of course, you're all probably researchers, research is not done in a vacuum by one person. So I want to acknowledge the wonderful team that I am very lucky to work with. So as Tissyana was saying, our work and the Ethics Network for Course-Based Opportunities in Undergrad Research is funded by NSF. I am one of the co-PIs, Dr. Olimpo, Dr. Darcy, and Aime, our grad research assistant, are also part of this effort, as well as other collaborators like Dr. Rosenberg and Dr. Bat, and also, I'm forgetting, David Sparza. Anyway, so I wanted first to introduce what Encore is. So Encore is a network of individuals. It's a very dynamic and diverse community that welcomes individuals, any individual who is interested in advancing responsible and ethical conduct of research, which I'm going to refer as RECR for short. So education, responsible and ethical conduct of research education in course-based undergraduate research experiences. Now, this being CBLSE, probably what cures are doesn't need an introduction, but just briefly, I'm going to say these are usually courses, laboratory courses in our case for biology, where students are conducting research as part of the course. And so what we are interested in studying in this particular paper is the question of students are doing authentic research, right? Some of that research might be actually lead to publications, right? And so as we know, as researchers, part of the researcher mindset is always thinking about how do we do research in a responsible and ethical manner. And so our thought is, if the students are doing research, then are we also including that part of the research process into their learning? And so to do that, basically, we started this study with 6 different research questions. The first one that we were interested to know was to what extent, if at all, is RECR, so research, responsible and ethical conduct of research instruction, including in the cures. What are the approaches that are being used for including instruction about RECR in the cures? What are some of the ethical issues that the cure facilitators are facing, right? So are there any specific issues with, unethical or irresponsible conduct of science that our students are, having in these environments? What are the topics, the RECR topics that are most commonly addressed by the facilitators in their cures? And how is this effectiveness of this education being assessed? And finally, what are the needs of the cure community so that we can achieve effective integration of this type of education within our cures? So to answer all of these questions, we used a mixed methods approach. Basically, we started with a national survey that we sent out. We distributed through different groups like CureNet and in different conferences where individuals that work on cures usually tend to hang out. And then, so we had 66 individuals that took that survey from very different backgrounds, from very different institutions, from community colleges to R1 institutions, from, institutions that are more minority serving to institutions that are primarily white institutions. So a very diverse group of individuals that answered this survey. And then in the survey, we asked them if they were open to discussing their views on this topic in a more semi-structured way through interviews. And so we had interviews with a subset, excuse me, of these individuals that answered the survey. And so what did we learn? Basically, I'm going to start with the first question, which is, is it being covered at all? Is RECR, responsible and ethical conduct of research, is it being covered at all? And what are the issues that these instructors are facing, right? So the issues, the respondents basically told us that the issues that they face, the main one is collaboration, right? So issues with, not collaborating well with the students, not collaborating well with their partners, or, maybe issues between, for mentorship, because a cure environment is usually a very mentorship heavy environment, right? Because the instructor of the cure is basically collaborating and guiding these students to do the research, right? And so not surprisingly, I guess, more than 50% of the respondents said that some of the issues, the ethical and responsible issues, conduct of research issues that they face were issues of collaboration. There were some also about authorship, ownership, and misconduct. But again, the main one was collaboration, right? And then the other thing that we were happy and a little bit surprised to see, I would say, is that basically almost every instructor is already talking about issues of responsible and ethical conduct of research in some way, right? So the majority of instructors are focusing on issues of lab safety, right? So how to conduct research in a responsible manner in the lab environment. But many instructors were also talking about, ethical and responsible research design, or data sampling, and how to use statistics in a responsible and ethical manner, right? So basically, one major take-home message of what we found is that basically most of the instructors of these cures are already covering some of these topics. Now, the thing that I want to point out in here is that most of the topics that are covered by most of the instructors are kind of more related to the experimental aspects of the cure, right? So how do you work safely in the lab? How do you design your research in a responsible way? And this might be because, cures are usually the first research experience for students, especially, for example, here at Gonzaga, I teach a cure that is basically our biology students take during their first semester. And so very often is the first time that students are in a research environment. And so the focus tends to be, how do you do research and what are the, the ethical and responsible implications of that? And so I guess not surprisingly, the main topics that are addressed in terms of RECR are related to that. Then we moved on to ask them questions about the instructional approaches that they are using to integrate this education of RECR into their cures. Here we were a little bit surprised about the results, because as you can see here in the figure, the approach that is used the most is actually corrective. So this is telling us that a majority of the instructors are talking about issues of ethics and responsible conduct of research as a response to an issue that happened in the cure. The second most common one was the context based within the cure. And what this means basically is talking about things as you're doing research, right? So one thing that comes to mind is, for example, in my cure, all of my students have to have a very detailed lab notebook, right? And so when we talk about how to keep a lab notebook, we briefly talk about, why, right? Like the responsibility and the ethical aspect of that. But it's more, it's more about, like, as the topics are arising, we talk about that. It's not really kind of well thought out and planned integration of RECR into the cure. Some people do have like independent didactic sessions about RECR, or independent workshop seminars that the students need to attend or participate in addition to the cure. But the majority of the instructors are basically doing this integration a little bit more as it's needed, right? In terms of the instructional methods that are used, because probably as a reflection of these topics are coming up as they're needed, the main way that education in terms of RECR is happening in cures is through practical application, right? So as the students are doing the research, instructors are talking, or the facilitators are talking with them about the ethics and the responsible conduct of research. There were some individuals, some facilitators of cures that do have more involved, I will say, instructional methods. So there were people who have written assignments about RECR or presentations, or maybe they bring up case studies to the cure and talk about those things. But the majority of the instructors were basically relying on the practical, day-to-day of doing research and bringing those topics up as the research is happening. One thing that we were very surprised about was that when we asked them, how are they assessing these goals, right? Like their education goals in terms of RECR, how are they assessing that the students are actually achieving those goals? And 76% of respondents basically said that they do not conduct any type of assessment, right? So this was a big surprise for us, and it definitely points out at a need for the biology cure community to actually come together, think more about how to integrate these RECR topics into our cures, the type of pedagogical techniques that we are utilizing to do that, and then actually assessing if it's working or not, right? Because ethics and responsible conduct of research is key for researchers, for doing research, and for the scientific community. And there's a lot of literature out there saying that the actual effectiveness of these interventions is very variable depending on the instructional methods used and depending on the topics that are covered. And so I think it is important for us as cure instructors not only to talk about these things, but actually to assess if the students are getting that information through, and more importantly, applying that information as researchers. We also asked the survey respondents about what they think the benefits for bringing up for education about RECR are in their cures. And big majority of the respondents, so 85%, basically said that one of the huge benefits of talking about RECR in their cures is that the students understand the process of science more. Also, 85% of the respondents said that is important for professional advancement. So some of them talked about, how having this type of education might make the students more competitive for certain, for example, for graduate programs or maybe medical school. 38% talked about how understanding responsible and ethical conduct of science actually could help students trust the process of science more. And then 31% basically said that the benefit would be basically actually the students internalizing this responsibility and decreasing the unethical behavior as they do their research. So I'm going to use some quotes that we got regarding these topics from our interviews. So for example, one of the responses was somebody who said, that it helps them understand the process of science, basically said, quote, "It helps the students to have a more complete understanding of the process of science. I think ethics is just as much part of the process of science as teaching them how to use a piece of equipment or a technique or statistics," right? So ethics as an integral part of the scientific process. Here's an example of somebody who mentioned something about the trust in science, right? So quote, "For students that aren't necessarily going to be scientists, I think it's important that they understand that the science literacy aspect of it. So how do scientists work and how do we trust when something is published that is actually correct and not just a bunch of made up lies?" So I think including the ethics for those students, ethics and RECR, is important in that aspect. And this might resonate with a lot of what's happening in our world and the misunderstanding of the scientific process and how that affects everybody. So I think that's important. That is important to point out that a majority of the CURE instructors are thinking about these things and are thinking about how beneficial it is for the students to learn about how to responsibly and ethically do research. So then we moved on to ask the CURE instructors, what are their needs, right? And how prepared basically they feel to do these things. And so one of the questions we asked was what type of RECR training the instructors themselves have had, right? And so usually the instructors are scientists, right? So PhDs level or master's level individuals. And so therefore they have had some sort of RECR instruction, usually what is mandated by the institutions they work with. And so not surprisingly, about 43% of the instructors basically said that they have only had the mandatory training that is mandated by their institution. But the rest actually have had other types of training, whether it is additional training by their institution, whether it is external training or online training, or more than that maybe they have sought out by themselves. But 43% has only had the mandatory training, and so one of the things that came up as needs for the instructors to be able to integrate RECR into their cures was training, right? Professional development, like how do we talk about this when, perhaps the training that we have had is not very much, right? So when maybe ourselves, we're not very comfortable with the topic. So that's something that definitely came up in the interviews. In terms of what are the barriers for implementation, so what is stopping CURE instructors from talking about, educating their students about these topics? Not surprisingly, right? So it's always time, right? So 85% of the instructors says that one of the barriers is time, and we understand, right? CUREs are very busy. So students are doing their experiments and we're trying to get them to understand a lot of concepts. And so, yes, not surprisingly, time is one of the main barriers. Lack of materials of resources. So 46% of the respondents mentioned those. There's definitely not a lot of examples out there of how to integrate RECR into cures, specifically biology cures. As I mentioned before, so professional development was mentioned by a third of our respondents, in a little bit related to this perhaps lack of RECR training for ourselves. And then student preparedness was also mentioned by about a third of the respondents. And this is just a result of, students, cures being usually the first research experience for students. So obviously they are not coming with a lot of preparation in terms of RECR. In terms of what the needs are, so we asked the instructors, what would you need to basically start integrating RECR education into your cure? The biggest need is basically a toolkit, some examples of how to do this, right? Perhaps some activities that are already easy to implement into cures, right? The second was guidelines, so just some, maybe student learners objectives, or what should we cover at this level, that kind of thing. 54% of the respondents said that they really wanted some sort of central hub for all of these resources and, literature about that, those things, and kind of related to the lack of professional development that was mentioned as a need. So 38% of our respondents are interested in more professional development, specifically related to how to, integrate RECR into cures. And there was also some mention of emphasis on diversity, equity, and inclusion in this process as well. So basically, kind of like as a whole, what the take home is for me for our paper was that RECR, so responsible and ethical conduct of research, is really seen as something that is key in a cure because the students are doing research. And we were very happy to see that it's actually currently being addressed by most instructors. But we also found that the focus is more on the experimental aspects, and it is kind of introduced as either corrective or as needed type of education, and that there's no assessment. So we don't know if what we're doing is working. And so this is definitely calling, kind of screaming at us that we as the biology cure community need to think more about this, come together to come up with some ideas on how to, and examples on how to do this better in a more effective and thought out manner. And some regarding the needs and the barriers, of course, time, and then also resources, some sort of toolkit or examples of activities or something that we can, as instructors, we can just kind of plug and play that will help us integrate these RECR topics into our cures. And then, of course, the other big need that was mentioned was professional development. So based on this, we decided, the Encore team decided basically to create a professional development opportunity. And this is going to be a plug for our Encore Fellowship. And so what the Encore Fellowship is basically a 1-year-long professional development opportunity where, the fellows work with several of us in the Encore team who have a little bit more experience, perhaps integrating these RECR topics into our cures. And we guide the fellows in the development of some sort of tool for RECR integration into cures. It could be activities, it could be an assessment piece, it could be, a whole planning of integration of RECR through several courses. It could be perhaps designing professional development for the instructors at a specific institution, right? So it's very open in the sense of the type of products that could be developed. And basically what it is basically just an opportunity to network with others that are interested in this type of work and to think through the development of those tools with the bouncing ideas of us and others in the fellowship as well. And so if anybody here is interested in that, our next round of applications should start in the spring of 2022. So definitely keep an eye out for that. If you are interested in getting more information, you can always go to the Encore website, which I actually didn't put in here. I forgot that. Let me look it up really quick. So it's encore.utep.edu. And so you can find there more information about Encore and our work, as well as about the fellowship itself. And I think that's it for me. And I would like to just bring Tissyana back and we can start a conversation.
Awesome. Thank you so much. It's very informative to get a sense of where people are. I know, so I am not a biologist. I'm a social scientist by training, but I teach research methods. And so I think a lot about how we teach social science research methods. And I think, week 3 of my course is always ethics, because we, especially as social scientists, are working with human subjects. And I think it's really important to think about, how to ethically and responsibly work with human subjects. I think learning more about you, your pathway to this work is quite interesting. It would be, and I'm a early career researcher, so relatively young in the PhD world, and I know a lot of people are thinking about what can PhDs do outside of academia. And so I'm just wondering if you can talk a bit more about your kind of pathway, because this isn't necessarily what you went to grad school for, but has become, I think, a significant area of inquiry for you.
Yeah, definitely. And I should have said, at the beginning, I have not been trained as a biology education researcher. I have not been trained in social sciences methods. So this has actually been a really interesting, incursion into something that I never thought I was going to do. I have to credit my colleague, Jeff Olimpo from UTEP, who is basically, he's a biology education researcher, and he's the one that got me interested in this. And he's, basically my go-to person when we're talking about, methods and how do I code, the responses and those type of things, because that's not training that I ever received. So I started, as you mentioned, like I am a cellular and molecular biologist, and I still do that. So my lab bench research is still focused on molecular and cellular biology. But then after my postdoc, I was kind of like questioning whether I wanted to continue doing research or not. And so I decided to take a position, as you mentioned, as the associate director for undergrad research at UTEP. And that is more of an administrative position where I was co-directing some of the programs that we had at UTEP to engage students in undergrad research. And that just fascinated me, because I found research as an undergrad student, right? So I started doing research as an undergrad, and that's what hooked me on the research itself. And so to me, being able to provide those opportunities for students and to learn more about how those opportunities benefit students was just very fascinating. And so that's how I ended, doing this little switch into biology education, and specifically cures, undergrad research opportunities in the classroom. So it's definitely something that, if we have any PhD students or postdocs out there, it is worth it to explore other areas that maybe you haven't thought of. And it's enlightening, and it opens your mind about other things to do.
I've always thought of, again, as a research methods instructor, my class is one way to invite students to be scientists. So I'm in the Department of Child and Adolescent Development. So it's not immediately clear that students can pursue research as a career. And so I definitely think it's important to frame the course as a way to invite students into being a scientist.
Right.
We have a participant question. So they wrote, I would like to hear more about student preparedness. Does this reflect concerns about student preparation to engage the disciplinary information or background in ethics? So student preparedness was one of the themes that came up, I believe. So if you could elaborate more on that.
Yeah. So the question was, the way it was phrased, it is specifically asked about the student, what was the level of preparedness regarding responsible and ethical conduct of research that they expected from their students. So it was not about, the engagement with the field or the topics in the field, but it was specifically about responsible conduct of research and ethics. And the responses were mostly that, they didn't expect their students to know anything about this, as we mentioned, because, they often cures are the first experience that students have with research. And so as instructors for those courses, perhaps we don't expect students to come up with those ideas just without having the research experience first. Yeah.
One thing that also came up was DEI. And I'm wondering if you can elaborate more about that as well. So I definitely, science, I think has been taught in a certain way, right? Like the status quo isn't very inviting, I think, to students of color, particularly or first generation college students, right? They think of science as something to be done by a man in a lab coat. And so I very intentionally think about the way I teach research methods through the lens of DEI to really invite students into it. And so I'm wondering, DEI came up as a theme, and I'm wondering if you can say more about that.
Right. So if I remember correctly, the comments around that was that one of the needs were to find ways to talk about responsible and ethical conduct of research from a diversity perspective, right? Like you're correct. I mean, it's not only that science and STEM disciplines have not been very welcoming of diversity, but also research has been, sometimes not very, not only welcoming, but actually damaging to minority communities, right? So I'm thinking, Tuskegee studies, all of those things, right? And so that's why I think these instructors brought that up, because I think that it is important for us to think about that and to talk about this, what has happened in the past, the history, and therefore the need to think about equity and inclusion when we're thinking about research as part of the ethical, reasoning that goes into that. I don't know. So I have some colleagues that talk about those things specifically when they're talking about ERCR. To be entirely honest, it's mostly talking about case studies like Tuskegee and all of those things. So I think we definitely will benefit from other, types of tools to talk about DEI in the context of RECR. And so, if somebody is interested in developing these tools, join us at the Encore Fellowship, because we're definitely interested in thinking about those lines a little bit more.
Yeah, I think it seems to be my experience kind of hanging out in the research methods instructors community. We are often presenting, at least with human subjects violations, we are often thinking of them as something in the past, right? So the first thing they're kind of learning about is Tuskegee. But those things remain very present today, right? We can think about mass sterilization and a lot. And so I'm wondering, what are kind of contemporary ethical issues that the biology community should be thinking about when presenting it, right? I think, presenting it as an issue of the past is a DEI issue, right? So what are kind of contemporary things that folks should be thinking about in cures?
Yeah. So one of the things that I bring up in my classes, so I teach an advanced class on molecular and cell biology, and we discuss clinical trials and all of those things. And normally I send my students to the clinical trial databases from NIH, and I ask them, go find the study where they tested these drug, right? And they're often very surprised to find that unfortunately, a majority of the cases, these clinical studies do not include a diverse population, right? And so that is a problem because these clinical studies are basically being used to test drugs that everybody is going to use. And very often, unfortunately, they're being tested in, white males, so sometimes females, right? And so it's just not, the diversity in those clinical trials is still not there, right? Another topic that has come up, and actually NIH has addressed some of that, is, for example, in biology, when we use mouse models or when we use cell lines that come from patients, right? Oftentimes it's like we only use male mice, right, to do the study. And then that, of course, you're leaving out 50% of the population, right? So what happens in the other 50%? And so we do talk about these things. And I think it is important to, as you said, not just stay in the past and be like, oh, that was a problem that was fixed now, right? Because it's not. And so our students need to be aware that it is still a problem.
Yes, thank you so much. We have another question that I would like for you to think about. So they asked, in your national study, was there any information collected from respondents about student satisfaction with RECR topics? Essentially, was there any corroborating evidence saying that students also wanted to see more of these topics in their classes in addition to the instructors?
For this study, we did not survey any students. That might be an interesting study to do in the future. So yeah, we did not survey any students, and since 76% of the instructors that we surveyed say that they're not assessing, so then we don't really have any of the student voices in the study. And so yeah, that's an important point.
And it's also, I think it's also hard. Students, it's been my experience, students aren't always dying to take cures, right? It's like, part of the major that they have to complete. And it seems to be one of the classes that they're least excited about. So students don't always know that they want to learn this. So I feel like the students at the beginning of my class are like, oh, what am I doing? And by the end, they're like, no, this was really helpful. So I think student voice is important, but it might, they don't always know that what they're going to learn is going to be enjoyable and applicable. One of the things that I'm thinking about, you said this kind of lack of assessment was concerning, or striking rather. What might assessment look like? And I think kind of a follow-up question to that is, in the paper, you all write that, developing an ethical mindset isn't something that happens in one semester, right? So we can't expect one class to kind of take care of that. So is there like course mapping that departments should do to think about, having students really develop this ethical mindset over time so that they leave college with a good understanding of ethical science?
Yeah. So let me start with the second part, because that one is easier to answer.
Yes.
Yes. So we have been thinking about that. And one of the things that we point out in the paper is that we think that the community, the biology cure community as a whole, as well as individual departments and institutions, should be thinking about this as not developing RECR interventions for one class, or even for part of a class, right? Like addressing 2 activities in a semester, right? But more like mapping horizontally within a class, and then also vertically, like throughout the whole 4 years of the bachelor's, in our case for undergraduate students, right? So that they get this content and they think about these issues over and over and over again, because we think it's something so important that it needs to be present throughout the course of their academic career. Regarding the assessment, that's a really hard question, because there are some assessments that exist. There are some that have been published at least and validated. But most of the ones we have found, they focus more on ethics in general, right? Not so much on research, responsible conduct of research and research ethics. Also, the few that exist that are focused on RECR tend to be either very general or focused mostly on more advanced, scientists who are more advanced in their careers, because historically, RECR usually occurs during your postdoc, during your grad student time, right? And so those assessments that are out there are usually at that level, right? And so for me, at least, for example, my cure, one of the cures that I teach is first semester freshman, right? So those assessments are not going to be very useful for me because they are expecting a complete different understanding of science and of RECR. And so we haven't really found assessments that are specifically tailored for cures in biology with the undergraduate level in mind. And so that's why one of the things that we're interested in the Encore Fellowship is in fellows who are interested in developing those assessments. And in fact, some people in the Encore Group are already thinking about developing some of those things. So hopefully in the future, we'll have more.
Yes, which is another plug for the fellowship. If this is something that interests you, folks should look into it. There is a question about the instruments that you used in your paper. Are they, can you talk more about the measurement component? Were they validated? I know there was a lot of kind of back and forth with your research group. So just talk about the measurement component of your paper. And they also said that they wanted to look them over, but the measurement component is also in the appendix, correct? That's provided in the paper. Okay, great.
And the whole survey is there as well. So if you're interested in, looking at exactly the questions, the wording of the questions, all of those things, definitely go to the paper, and in the supplementary material, you have all of that. In terms of how it was developed, so basically the conversation started at one of the Encore annual meetings. And, that's where we thought of, okay, one of the first things that we need to do as a group is most likely figure out what's out there, right? What are people doing? What is the state of this? And so basically, a couple of the people, so Jeff Olimpo, Chris Darcy, they were the ones that, as well as other people, started thinking about what are the questions that we want to answer. And they started creating those questions for the survey. And then there was a lot of feedback within the Encore group. And then also the questions were sent to other people who are external. I believe there were 12 other people that reviewed those questions before we actually implemented the survey. And so these were people who had training not only on biology education, but they were also people who know a lot about cure development. We also had bioethicists in there. To make sure that we kind of like cover the whole gamut of expertises. And so, their feedback was taken into account to produce the final survey that was sent out.
Awesome, thank you. And in the chat, I did put a link to the supplemental material. So the participants can find that there, or the attendees. Another question, and I'll kind of add on to that question. Is do you have any data about programs that integrate RECR across their curriculum? And kind of an added part to that is, do you know what like the best practices are, like in this work? So not necessarily this paper specifically, but in your work, have you identified, departments that are doing this well, or instructors that are doing this well versus those who are doing it not as well, right? And what are those differences, if so?
Right. So I know there's efforts that are ongoing and maybe already implemented from some of the people in the Encore advisory board who are directors for undergraduate like CURE programs, right? So they actually direct the implementation of cures at an institutional level, and they are definitely thinking about this layering and this layering of the education of RECR education through different cures, through different semesters, all of that. So definitely there's some examples of that, of people who are doing these amazing efforts to do that at the institutional level. I don't know, I don't remember off the top of my head if those are published yet. If not, I think they're probably coming up out pretty soon, so definitely look up for that. And it's just, I think in terms of how to do that well, it's basically just really thinking very purposefully about this alignment and this horizontal and vertical integration through several semesters, through several cures, and how to do that. As I said, unfortunately, there's not a lot of examples published about this. And so it's hard for me to give a specific example. Off the top of my head, so I can think of 4 publications about efforts to integrate RECR education in cures. And I believe one of those was actually multi-semester. But then again, there's no assessment being done. So it's hard for us to know how effective these efforts have been. But anyway, so that's why, that's one of the reasons behind Encore is this need. There's a huge need for examples for, assessment of these types of approaches so that we can figure out what works and what doesn't, and we can move on with effectively integrating this.
Yeah, that brings me to my next question is, given everyone's kind of bandwidth to do new things at the moment, what is your group doing and hoping to do to help instructors incorporate this into cures?
Right, so our main effort is obviously the fellowship, right? So we have, this is our second year with the fellowship. And so every year we've had, I believe it's like 15 or 20 fellows. So definitely there's a lot of people who are interested, and there's a lot of people who have somehow managed to find the bandwidth to work on this, even in the middle of everything that is going on, which is amazing. Yeah, and so there's a lot of great fresh ideas coming out of that. And, like personally, I am also working on some examples of activities that can be done in classes and how to try to assess that in my own classroom. And so I think everybody at the Encore Group that's part of what we do. And so hopefully we will be able to provide more of a toolkit or a how-to in the next couple of years, so that other people can start implementing those things in a hopefully easier way.
You brought up publishing and kind of making things publicly available, which made me think of open science. So I'm a psychologist by training, and I think the field of psychology has taken a lot of heat in terms of like data fraud and replication. And so there's really a push for open science, to minimize data fraud, and also, also to think of science as a public good versus a private enterprise. As textbook editions change, there's a lot more kind of open science being thrown into like research methods textbooks, and I'm constantly thinking about how do I teach this, and so I'm wondering what you're thinking in terms of what students need to know about kind of open science thinking in terms of biology. Like thinking about like pre-registering your studies, doing preprints, things like that. Is this something that we should be, talking about with them?
I mean, definitely. I think that's the way science is moving to. I mean, that's the future of it, I think. In my field, in molecular cell biology, there's definitely been a move towards that. So there are now repositories where we can basically share our large data sets, whether it is, things about gene expression or protein-protein interactions and those types of things. And so there's definitely been a push for more open science regarding those things and making those data sets available for others to use. And, if they want to check the data or whatever. So there's definitely a push for that. There's definitely a huge push for preprints. And so I think that's what the field is moving towards. And I think that then that's important for us to address when we're talking with our students. In fact, like, for example, in my research lab, we often use these publicly available data sets. And so that's a conversation that I have with my own students about, the responsibility that it takes to put a data set like that out in the open, right, for everybody to use. And, and so that's something that is definitely in our mind. I am not sure. I mean, potentially we can bring that up in the classroom. So I can think of, like a cure that is based on genetics, for example, and they're using this type of databases. Is an amazing opportunity to talk about this with students in a context that is relevant to them. So that's one of the beauties about cures, is that I think that the best way to learn about responsible and ethical conduct of research is while you're doing research, because that's when it's relevant, right? And so cures in that sense are the perfect place to talk about these topics, because the students are working with these data sets, and so they can see the relevance of using these data sets in a responsible way, an ethical way.
Right, so, it's no longer an abstract concept.
Exactly. Because if we just talk about these things, but they're not using them, then I don't think they fully realize the impact that this, open science can have.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
absolutely. We are nearing our time together. And one thing I want to talk about, so I've mentioned several times, I'm a social scientist and I actually use mixed methods. So reading your paper was actually awesome and a breath of fresh air to see, a biologist kind of embrace that. And I think, when the work is exploratory, the kind of sequential mixed methods approach that you use is really beneficial to gaining more insight into this topic. And I think, as someone who does mixed methods and qualitative work, a lot of people will talk about generalizability. It's the small sample. Who does this actually generalize to? Or, they really say it doesn't generalize. And I'd like to kind of just reverse that and ask you about, given the data you collected and the people you spoke with, who does this, generalize to?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think we were very lucky that the group of people who responded to the survey was actually very diverse. As I mentioned, we had, instructors from community colleges. We had instructors from, primarily undergraduate institutions or research focus institutions, right? And so I think that allowed us to capture a lot of different voices, different types of cures, different student populations. And so, yeah, I mean, we might not have a huge number of respondents, but I think the insight that we got, because we had such a diverse group and because we were able to follow up with some of them to actually get a little bit more of a taste of what is going on, how are you doing this, and what are your needs, I think, I don't know how generalizable it can be, but at least it gives us a good idea of what is out there and what can we do next? What are the needs that we can focus on to actually make this integration, purposeful integration of RECR in the cures, something that hopefully everybody does in the future, right? So yeah, I think the diversity of the group really allowed us to get a very interesting mix of responses and based on different experiences. And so, yeah, I mean, that's
Yeah.
all I can say.
Yeah, and I think in terms of, again, going back to DEI, having that variability in terms of where the instructors were, right? So like science isn't only something that gets to be cool and fun and prestigious at R1 institutions, right? We need our community college students to have really vibrant experiences in the classroom as well. So I really think having that variability is quite great. And despite that variability, you actually did find, common themes among everyone, right? So there was a range in terms of, the experience of higher education. And in that range, people were still talking about the same thing. So it really is something that spans the spectrum.
Yeah, we definitely saw that there were some common themes. And then we also saw that there were themes that were not in common, right? Because it depended on the cure, right? Like if we were doing human subjects research, then maybe they were focusing more on those issues, right? Than, for example, in my cure, where we're working with phages and bacteria, right? And so we definitely saw that, some convergence of some themes, but then also divergence and diversity depending on the type of cure and the type of institution. And so I think it was a very broad examples of cures and what's going on. Yeah.
My last question to you is, what's next? I think this is a really great start, right? And it provided rich information. So what are you and your team, hoping to do next research-wise?
Yeah, so definitely, the Encore team is a large network of people. So each one of us has our own, focus and our own research projects that are related to RECR and cures. As a group, I think, focusing on the fellowship as well as some other studies related to this, integration of RECR in cures at a national level or an institution level are things that we're focusing on. Personally, as I briefly mentioned, my research group and myself, we are developing some activities that we can incorporate in our cure. It's a freshman level cure. And so we are field testing those and working on fine tuning, trying to assess the effectiveness of those activities. And that's something that hopefully we will make public in the future. So thank you.
Great. Awesome. Thank you so much. This was a wonderful discussion.
Thank you.
All right. Something before, in case you don't see it, someone wrote in the Q&A, thank you, such an important area. I can see this across the curriculum. This could pull together some needs we have in my department. So thank you. Your work is very much appreciated by the attendees.
Thank you. I think that there is an assessment for today. Hold on. So that CBE LSE wanted us to do. So
Yes.
basically write on the chat box. Please do write in the chat box something interesting that you learned during today's session. We would appreciate that.
Yes, for those of you that are still with us, I forgot about that. So if you can take a moment to write in the chat one interesting thing you learned today, we would very much appreciate that.